I never thought I'd be in this position, questioning whether I was right or wrong for confronting my sister so harshly. The events of last week have been playing over and over in my head, leaving me torn between conviction and regret. I'm 27, my sister is 30, and we've always had a complicated relationship, sometimes close, other times distant. But this time feels different. She's been married to Mike, who's 32, for 5 years. They also have a 3-year-old son together. Mike has always stood out to me as a genuinely good person. He's kind, hardworking, and deeply committed to his family. It's hard not to admire him, especially when you see how much he takes on. But then there's my sister. For as long as I can remember, she's had a strong personality, loud, opinionated, and sometimes abrasive. It's part of what makes her who she is. But in her marriage, that dynamic feels imbalanced. She doesn't work, doesn't contribute much around the house, and seems to rely entirely on Mike to keep things running. While Mike works long hours, takes care of their child, and even handles most of the cleaning, she spends her days lounging, scrolling through her phone, or watching TV. What's worse, she openly mocks Mike in front of others, often at family gatherings or parties. Her jokes are constant, always belittling him for being too organized or unable to relax. She acts like it's all harmless fun, but you can see the hurt in Mike's eyes every time. He's the kind of guy who doesn't push back, so he just laughs it off, but it's obvious it wears on him. This tension has been building for years, and last week, everything finally came to a head. Mike has always been the kind of person who inspires admiration, not just from me, but from everyone who gets to know him. From the moment my sister introduced him to the family, he stood out as someone with an unshakable sense of responsibility and kindness. He's one of those rare people who genuinely puts others before himself, no matter the cost. It's not just that he works hard, though he does, clocking long hours at his demanding job to provide for their family. It's how he comes home, visibly tired, yet still finds the energy to do what needs to be done. Whether it's tidying up the house, cooking dinner, or giving their son the attention and care he deserves, Mike just does it. No complaints, no fanfare. He simply does what needs to be done. What amazes me most is his patience. He never raises his voice, never seems to let stress get the better of him, even when he has every right to. I've seen him calm their crying son with a soothing voice when he himself looked like he was running on fumes. I've watched him quietly pick up after my sister, whether it's her forgotten coffee mug or a pile of clothes left in the living room, without so much as a sigh of frustration. It's not just his actions, though. It's his attitude. Mike's sense of humor, his ability to find joy in the smallest moments, and his genuine warmth make him someone you can't help but respect. But even the best people have limits, and I can't help but wonder how much longer Mike can keep going like this. To see someone like him be treated with so little gratitude, or worse, with outright disrespect, is something I've struggled to reconcile for years. It's not just unfair, it's painful to witness. And it's not just Mike who deserves better. Their son deserves a happy, healthy home where both parents work together. Watching this dynamic has been like watching a slow-motion train wreck, and it's left me feeling powerless, until I finally spoke up. My sister, on the other hand, is an entirely different story. I wish I could say that her role in their household complements Mike's efforts, that she's the supportive partner he deserves. But that couldn't be further from the truth. Over the years, I've watched her drift further and further into what feels like apathy, seemingly uninterested in contributing to the life they're building together. She doesn't work, and while I understand that staying at home is a valid choice, it doesn't feel like she uses that time to better their household or even take on the responsibilities that come with being a stay-at-home parent. The housework? That's Mike. Taking care of their son? Mostly Mike, too. My sister seems content to spend her days scrolling through her phone, binge-watching TV shows, or going out for coffee with her friends. What frustrates me the most is the lack of awareness, or maybe it's just a lack of caring, about how this affects Mike. She acts like this dynamic is perfectly normal, as though it's his job to shoulder everything because he's the man of the house. But relationships aren't supposed to work that way. Then there's the way she talks about Mike. I can't count how many times I've heard her joke about him being a neat freak or tease him for being unable to relax. She'll roll her eyes and say, "He's always doing something. He can't just sit down like a normal person." It's said with a laugh, but it doesn't feel funny. It feels cruel. She doesn't seem to see how much her words cut him, or maybe she doesn't care. Mike laughs along, but his expression gives him away every time. There's a heaviness in his eyes, a quiet resignation that's impossible to ignore. Seeing this dynamic unfold day after day, year after year, has made it harder and harder for me to stay silent. I've tried to talk to my sister about it before, but she brushes me off, claiming I don't understand. Maybe she's right. But what I do understand is that this imbalance is tearing Mike down piece by piece. Looking back, the signs were always there. Even before they were married, the dynamic between my sister and Mike was uneven. When they were dating, I remember noticing how much effort Mike put into making her happy. He planned their dates, handled the logistics, and was always quick to compromise whenever there was a disagreement. At the time, I thought it was sweet. I assumed my sister would grow into her role in the relationship, that she'd match his efforts once they settled into their life together. But things didn't change after they got married. If anything, they became more lopsided. Mike took on more and more of the responsibilities, while my sister seemed to step back. At first, I thought she might be adjusting to married life, or that she'd take on more when they had a child. When their son was born, I thought, this is it. This will change things. But it didn't. If anything, her attitude became more dismissive. I noticed how she started taking Mike for granted, assuming he'd always be the one to fix things, clean up, and carry the weight of the household. I also noticed how she spoke to him changed, less supportive, more critical. The little jabs started appearing, disguised as jokes. I told myself they were harmless at first, but as the years went on, they became sharper, more frequent. What bothered me the most wasn't just her behavior, it was how Mike responded. Or rather, how he didn't. He never stood up for himself, never pushed back. He just smiled, nodded, and kept going. I couldn't help but wonder how long he could keep it up. The cracks in their relationship were becoming too big to ignore, and I feared it was only a matter of time before something gave way. The jokes, though, were the hardest to stomach. My sister's pattern of mocking Mike started subtly, but grew louder and more frequent over time. At family gatherings, she seemed to delight in putting him on the spot, always under the guise of humor. She'd laugh and make some comment about how he couldn't sit still, how he was obsessed with cleaning, or how he didn't know how to relax. At first, people would chuckle along, maybe assuming it was harmless banter between a husband and wife. But for me, sitting there and watching Mike's reaction, it never felt harmless. He would laugh, sure, but it was the kind of laugh that didn't reach his eyes. He'd make some lighthearted reply to deflect the attention, but you could see the discomfort in his body language. The way his shoulders tensed, the way his gaze dropped for just a second too long. It was clear these moments hurt him. One particular moment stands out in my memory. It was at a birthday party for one of our cousins. Mike had just finished helping with the setup, arranging tables and chairs, and organizing food while my sister chatted with relatives. As the party wound down, he started tidying up, and my sister loudly joked, "Look at him go! He's like a human Roomba. Can't stop cleaning even for 1 minute." Everyone laughed, but Mike's face froze for a split second before he joined in. I couldn't stop thinking about how unfair it was. Here was a man who had spent hours working to make the party enjoyable for everyone, only to be reduced to a punchline. My sister didn't seem to notice, or care, that her words cut deeper than she realized. It wasn't just a one-off thing. Over time, these moments accumulated, each one adding another layer to my frustration. Seeing someone as hardworking and kind as Mike be humiliated by the person who should have been his biggest supporter was infuriating. And yet, I kept biting my tongue, unsure if it was my place to say anything. That restraint, however, wouldn't last much longer. What stood out most during all those moments was Mike's unflinching ability to endure. No matter how sharp the joke, how public the criticism, or how much was asked of him, he always responded with the same calm demeanor. He would smile, nod, and carry on as if nothing had happened. At first glance, it seemed admirable, a display of patience and maturity. But the more I saw, the more I realized it wasn't patience. It was resignation. It was in the small details. The way he avoided eye contact when the teasing got too personal. The forced chuckle he gave whenever my sister delivered one of her quips. The way he would immediately throw himself into some task, as if physical activity could shield him from the sting of her words. Mike wasn't standing up for himself, and that's what broke my heart the most. I could see the toll it was taking on him, how each comment chipped away at his confidence bit by bit. He worked so hard, gave so much, and yet he seemed to believe that this dynamic was normal, even deserved. I wanted to shake him, to tell him that he didn't have to put up with it, that he deserved more respect than he was getting. But every time I tried to bring it up, he'd brush it off with a soft smile and a vague comment about how, it's just how she is. He seemed more afraid of rocking the boat than of addressing how much he was hurting. I wondered if he stayed for their son, determined to keep the family together no matter what. Or maybe he stayed because he was too kind to walk away. Whatever the reason, his silence made my own frustration harder to bear. Someone needed to say something, but I didn't know how, or if, I had the right. It all came to a head during what should have been an ordinary family dinner. My parents had invited everyone over for a casual Sunday evening, a tradition we try to keep alive even as life pulls us in different directions. The air was warm, the table was set with all our favorite dishes, and for a moment, it felt like one of those rare occasions when we could all just enjoy each other's company. Mike, as always, was at the center of the preparations. He arrived early to help my mom in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, setting the table, and making sure everything was perfect. My sister showed up later, breezing in with her usual nonchalance, chatting with my dad and barely glancing at the work Mike had put into making the evening run smoothly. As the meal began, the atmosphere was pleasant enough. The conversation flowed easily, ranging from lighthearted updates about work and hobbies to teasing jokes about childhood memories. Mike was his usual self, helpful, attentive, and quietly participating in the background without drawing much attention. My sister, on the other hand, was louder, cracking jokes and dominating the conversation. At some point, after everyone had eaten, Mike stood up to clear the table, automatically collecting plates and utensils without being asked. It was such a natural gesture, one he always did without hesitation. But then, right on cue, my sister made her move. "Oh, look at Mike," she said with a laugh loud enough to draw everyone's attention. "Can't even sit still for one dinner. What is it, Mike? You afraid the dishes will grow legs and walk away?" The room filled with chuckles, but I didn't join in. I couldn't. Something inside me snapped. I could see the look on Mike's face, the familiar, strained smile, and I knew I couldn't let this one go. This time, I couldn't sit silently and watch her humiliate him again. What happened next would change the entire dynamic of the evening, and frankly, of our family. The moment my sister made that joke, the room shifted. Most people at the table chuckled, some genuinely, others out of habit, but I couldn't bring myself to smile. I just stared at her, feeling a surge of frustration that had been building for years finally boil over. Her tone was light, almost playful, but the words themselves weren't harmless. "Can't even sit still for one dinner," she'd said, mocking the very trait that kept their household running. Mike's work ethic, his willingness to take care of things without complaint, was something I admired. Yet, here she was, turning it into a punchline for her own amusement. Mike, as usual, tried to laugh it off. He stood there holding a stack of plates, chuckling softly, but I could see the flicker of discomfort in his expression. It was so quick that most people wouldn't notice, but I did. The faint tightening of his jaw, the way his eyes darted down for a split second. It was the look of someone used to this kind of treatment, someone resigned to it. I glanced around the table, hoping someone else might say something. My mom, my dad, even my younger brother. But everyone just carried on, moving past the comment as though it hadn't happened. Maybe they didn't see the harm. Maybe they were just used to it. That's when I realized I couldn't stay silent anymore. The laughter, the indifference, it felt like complicity, and I couldn't be part of it. My sister's words weren't just harmless teasing. They were a symptom of a larger issue, one that had been festering for years. In that moment, it wasn't just about defending Mike. It was about finally acknowledging what I'd been too scared to say for so long. My sister's behavior wasn't just unfair, it was cruel. And the more I thought about it, the more I felt that someone needed to call her out. I didn't plan what I was going to say. It just spilled out of me, raw and unfiltered, driven by years of pent-up frustration. The words that followed changed everything. I couldn't hold it in any longer. As the chuckles died down and everyone began returning to their conversations, I spoke up. My voice was sharper than I intended, cutting through the hum of the room like a knife. "You don't deserve him," I said, glaring directly at my sister. The table went silent. Every pair of eyes shifted to me, the light-hearted atmosphere evaporating in an instant. My sister looked stunned, her mouth slightly open as if she hadn't quite processed what I'd just said. I didn't stop. The words poured out of me before I could even think to hold them back. "You don't deserve Mike. He does everything for you. Works all day, comes home, cleans, takes care of your son. And this is how you treat him? With jokes and disrespect? You should be ashamed." My sister's face turned a deep red, her shock quickly replaced by anger. "Excuse me?" she snapped, her voice rising. "Who do you think you are to talk to me like that? You don't know anything about my life, so just shut up." But I wasn't done. "I don't need to live in your house to see what's going on. We all see it. You sit back and let him do everything, then tear him down like it's a joke. It's not funny. It's cruel." The room was so quiet you could hear the clock ticking on the wall. My mom looked horrified. My dad sat frozen, and my brother stared at his plate. My sister, meanwhile, was shaking with fury. "You're jealous," she spat. "You're bitter because you're not married, and you'll never understand what it takes to make a marriage work." Her words stung, but I stood my ground. In that moment, I wasn't sure if I'd gone too far, but I knew I couldn't take it back. My sister didn't waste a second before retaliating. Her anger, sharp and unfiltered, filled the silence I had left behind. "You're unbelievable," she snapped, leaning forward as if to drive her words directly into me. "You think you're so high and mighty, judging me from your perfect little pedestal. But let me tell you something. You have no idea what you're talking about." Her voice was trembling, not from sadness, but from sheer rage. "You don't know what it's like to be married, to have a family, to live the kind of life I do. You sit there, single and clueless, pretending you have all the answers. You're jealous, plain and simple." I opened my mouth to respond, but she didn't give me a chance. "You've always been like this, haven't you? Acting like you're better than everyone else, but you're not. You're just bitter and lonely. So don't you dare talk about my husband, my family, or my choices ever again." Her words landed with the force of a slap, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. I glanced around the table, hoping for someone, anyone, to step in, but no one did. My mom looked mortified, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. My dad avoided eye contact entirely, and my brother kept staring down at his plate, clearly wishing he were somewhere else. I could feel my own anger rising, but this wasn't the time for another outburst. My sister's reaction was exactly what I'd expected: defensive, dismissive, and venomous. Still, her words stung in a way I hadn't anticipated. As she stood abruptly and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her, I was left wondering if I'd made things worse instead of better. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything I'd said. The moment my sister stormed out, the tension in the room became almost unbearable. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. It was as if we were all waiting for someone else to break the silence, but no one dared. My mom finally let out a shaky breath and turned to me, her face a mix of anger and disappointment. "What were you thinking?" she hissed, her voice low but laced with frustration. "This is family. You don't air dirty laundry like that, especially not in front of everyone." Her words felt like a reprimand, but I wasn't ready to back down. "Someone had to say it," I replied, my voice firm but quieter than before. "You've seen how she treats him. You've seen how much he does for her, and she acts like he's a joke. How is that fair? My mom shook her head, clearly struggling to find the right words. This isn't about fair. It's about respect. Respect for your sister and this family. You should have pulled her aside if you felt this strongly, not embarrassed her in front of everyone. I glanced around the table, searching for some sign of support, but most of the family avoided my gaze. My dad shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and my younger brother, who had always been the quietest of us, finally spoke up. "She's not wrong, though," he mumbled, barely loud enough for anyone to hear. "I mean, about Mike." Everyone turned to him, surprised by his sudden input. He looked up briefly, his face serious. "I've thought the same thing for a while now. The way she talks to him, it's not okay." His words gave me a sliver of validation, but they did little to lighten the tension. My mom shot him a look, and he immediately sank back into his chair, clearly regretting saying anything. The rest of the dinner was awkward and strained. Plates were cleared quietly, and conversations were forced and fragmented. Mike didn't say much, and neither did I. The weight of what had happened hung heavy over everyone, making the meal feel endless. By the time we left, I knew things wouldn't be the same. As I drove home that night, the entire scene replayed in my mind on an endless loop. Every word I'd said, every reaction, every silence, it all felt louder and more pronounced now that the adrenaline had worn off. I kept gripping the steering wheel tighter, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I gone too far? My mom's reaction echoed in my head, her disappointment ringing louder than anything else. I could still see the way my sister's face had turned red, her fury radiating across the table. She was humiliated, no question about it. But then I thought about Mike, the way his shoulders slumped as my sister stormed out, the exhaustion etched into his face, and my conviction began to creep back in. This wasn't the first time I'd watched her tear him down, but it was the first time I'd said anything. For years, I had sat through these moments, silently fuming as she turned Mike into the punchline of her jokes. Maybe I could have handled it better, but wasn't it worse to do nothing? The hardest part was the silence from everyone else. My mom's anger was expected, but my dad's refusal to even look at me stung in ways I didn't anticipate. And then there was my brother's quiet agreement. His words had validated what I felt, but his reluctance to say more left me questioning if I'd dragged him into a mess he didn't want to be part of. By the time I got home, my emotions had twisted into a knot of guilt, frustration, and doubt. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd set off a chain reaction I couldn't control. My sister wasn't speaking to me, my mom thought I was entirely in the wrong, and the family dinner, our tradition, now felt fractured. Still, underneath all of that, there was something else. Relief. For the first time, I'd said what I truly felt, and as much as I worried about the fallout, I couldn't deny that it felt right to finally speak up. Whether anyone else understood that or not, I wasn't sure. My sister and I have always had a complicated relationship. Growing up, we were close in the way that siblings often are, playing together, sharing secrets, and defending each other when things got tough. But there was also an undercurrent of rivalry that seemed to grow stronger as we got older. She's always been the louder, more assertive one, the type of person who commands attention when she walks into a room. I've always been quieter, more reserved, preferring to blend into the background. This difference in personality sometimes made it feel like we were living in two different worlds, even under the same roof. As teenagers, the rivalry deepened. My sister was popular, outgoing, and bold, while I was the bookish one, the one who avoided conflict and stayed out of the spotlight. She loved teasing me, sometimes in good fun, but other times it felt sharper, more intentional. When she got what she wanted, it often came with a smugness that made me feel small. This dynamic didn't change much as we became adults. She found ways to assert her dominance in subtle ways, pointed remarks about my choices, comparisons that made her life seem more successful or glamorous. I always tried to shrug it off, but the resentment lingered in the background, building over the years. When she married Mike, I initially thought it would change things between us. I hoped the responsibilities of marriage and parenthood might mellow her, maybe even make her more empathetic. But instead, her behavior seemed to magnify. She treated Mike the same way she'd treated me growing up, teasing, dismissing, always needing to have the upper hand. Looking back, I wonder how much of my outburst at dinner was about Mike and how much of it was about years of pent-up frustration with her. The lines between the two feel blurred, and I can't tell if that's what made my words feel so necessary or so personal. The day after the dinner, my mom called me. I knew she would. It was only a matter of time. I could feel her frustration even before I picked up the phone. "Do you understand what you did?" she asked, skipping any sort of pleasantries. Her voice was calm but carried that edge I'd grown familiar with, a mixture of disappointment and exhaustion. "I said what I thought needed to be said," I replied, bracing myself for the lecture I knew was coming. "You embarrassed your sister in front of the entire family," she said, her tone sharpening. "You didn't just make a point. You made it in the worst way possible. Do you think that's going to help anything?" I paused, trying to find the right words. "Mom, I couldn't just sit there anymore. You've seen how she treats Mike. Don't tell me you haven't noticed." She sighed heavily, the kind of sigh that felt like it carried years of unspoken thoughts. "Of course I've noticed. We all have. But calling her out like that, in front of everyone, that's not how you fix things. You just made her angrier. You've probably made things worse for Mike, too." That last part hit me harder than I expected. I hadn't considered that my actions might backfire on Mike, that my sister's anger could spill over into their home and make his life even harder. "But what was I supposed to do?" I asked, my voice softer now. Nobody else was saying anything. Everyone just laughs and lets it slide. She needs to hear it. "Maybe," my mom conceded, "but not like that. Family is supposed to protect each other, even from their own mistakes. You could have pulled her aside, talked to her privately. Instead, you made a scene, and now she's hurt. You're hurt. And this family feels more divided than ever." Her words lingered long after we hung up. I hated that she might be right. But deep down, I still felt that silence wasn't the answer either. Finding the balance between those two truths felt impossible. Later that evening, as I sat replaying the conversation with my mom, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my younger brother. "Hey, can we talk for a minute?" I called him, curious and slightly nervous about what he might say. He rarely involved himself in family drama, preferring to keep his head down and stay out of the fray. "I just wanted to say," he began, his voice hesitant, "I agree with what you said at dinner." The relief I felt was immediate, like a weight had been lifted. "You do?" I asked, leaning into the phone. "Yeah," he continued. "I've thought it for a while now. The way she talks to Mike. It's not okay. It's not fair to him, and honestly, it's hard to watch. But, He paused, and I could hear him choosing his words carefully. "I don't think you should have said it in front of everyone." There it was again, the same critique my mom had leveled at me. "I know," I said, exhaling slowly. "Maybe I should have handled it differently. But I just couldn't sit there and watch her humiliate him again." "I get it," he said quickly. "And I think she needed to hear it. I just worry that now she's going to dig her heels in even more. You know how she gets when she feels attacked." He wasn't wrong. My sister had always been stubborn, especially when it came to admitting fault. But hearing my brother validate my feelings, even cautiously, made me feel less alone in this mess. "I just wanted to say I'm proud of you for standing up for Mike," he added. Even if it wasn't perfect, it was brave. Those words stayed with me long after we hung up. For the first time since the dinner, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I wasn't entirely in the wrong. After my conversation with my brother, I found myself replaying the dinner in a new light. The main criticism everyone had, the one my mom and even my brother had gently pointed out, wasn't about what I'd said, but how I'd said it. Could I have handled it better? Should I have? In hindsight, I understood why my approach had struck such a nerve. Airing personal grievances in a public setting, especially in front of family, is always a risky move. It puts people on the defensive, corners them in a way that makes it almost impossible for them to see your point. I knew my sister's stubbornness, her aversion to being called out, and yet I'd done it anyway, loudly, in front of everyone. I tried to imagine how the evening might have gone if I'd chosen a different path. What if I'd waited until after dinner, pulled her aside, and spoken to her privately. Maybe I could have told her what I'd been feeling, why her treatment of Mike bothered me so deeply. Maybe I could have made her see my perspective without the sting of public humiliation. But then I thought about all the times I'd stayed silent before, all the moments when her words or actions had gone unchecked. Quiet conversations hadn't worked in the past. She always brushed me off, claiming I was overreacting or didn't understand her relationship. And in those moments at the dinner table, watching her make yet another joke at Mike's expense, the idea of waiting to speak felt impossible. Public or private, the issue was bigger than just one moment. It was about a pattern of behavior that had gone on for years, one that everyone had ignored or excused. I wasn't sure if a private conversation would have been enough to make her see the truth. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the real question wasn't whether I'd handled it perfectly. It was whether the message, flawed delivery and all, had finally made her stop and think. Even if it didn't fix everything, I hoped it had planted a seed of awareness she couldn't ignore. As I reflected on the fallout from the dinner, one thing remained crystal clear. My decision to speak up had been about more than just my sister. It was about Mike. For years, I'd watched him silently endure a dynamic that felt entirely one-sided. He worked tirelessly for their family, not just because it was expected, but because that's the kind of person he is. Committed, reliable, and selfless. And for just as many years, I'd watched my sister dismiss his efforts, mock his habits, and show a level of disregard that felt impossible to justify. It wasn't just that I admired Mike. I empathized with him. I could see how much he gave without asking for anything in return, how he absorbed her criticism without complaint, and how he kept going even when it was obvious he was running on empty. There were so many times I wanted to step in, to tell her she was wrong, to defend him when he wouldn't defend himself. But I'd always stopped myself, afraid of crossing a line or making things worse. I told myself it wasn't my place, that Mike didn't need me to fight his battles. But the dinner changed that. Seeing him stand there, holding those plates while my sister turned him into a joke yet again, I couldn't stay silent. The words came out before I could stop them, driven by the sheer injustice of it all. It wasn't about humiliating her or starting a fight. It was about reminding her, and everyone else, that Mike deserved better, that his efforts weren't invisible, that his kindness wasn't a weakness, and that someone noticed the sacrifices he made. Maybe my approach hadn't been perfect, but in that moment, I felt like I was standing up for someone who deserved more than silence. And I wasn't sure I could regret that. Mike's sacrifices were the kind that often went unnoticed. He never complained or sought recognition, which made it easy for people to overlook just how much he gave of himself. But if you really paid attention, as I had over the years, it became impossible to ignore. He worked long hours at a demanding job, not because he loved it, but because it was what their family needed. I once overheard him talking to my dad about how he'd passed up a promotion because it would require even more time away from home. "I need to be there for my son," he'd said, as if it was the simplest, most obvious choice in the world. And it wasn't just about providing financially. Mike was the kind of father who showed up, really showed up. He was there for bedtime stories, for scraped knees and temper tantrums, for every milestone, big or small. I'd seen him sit on the floor for hours building Lego towers with his son, his exhaustion masked by his genuine joy at being present. Then there was the housework. It wasn't just that he did it. It was the care and attention he put into it. Cooking meals, scrubbing floors, folding laundry. He tackled it all without hesitation, as if it were simply another part of his role as a husband and father. But what stood out most was his emotional steadiness. Even when my sister made her comments, even when her jokes clearly hurt, he never lashed out or let his frustration show. Instead, he swallowed his pride and kept going, perhaps thinking it was better to keep the peace than to address the imbalance head-on. The more I thought about it, the more I realized just how much Mike gave without ever expecting anything in return. It was admirable, yes, but also heartbreaking. Nobody, no matter how kind or selfless, should have to carry that much weight alone. And maybe that's why I felt so compelled to say something. Because if Mike wasn't going to stand up for himself, someone else had to. Being a bystander to someone else's pain is its own kind of burden. Over the years, watching Mike's quiet suffering had become almost unbearable. It wasn't the kind of pain you could easily point to. There were no dramatic fights, no shouting matches, no outward signs of conflict. It was the slow, invisible kind, the kind that comes from feeling unappreciated day after day. I don't think anyone else in the family saw it the way I did. Maybe they didn't look closely enough, or maybe they were just too used to the dynamic to question it. But I saw the way Mike's shoulders sagged just slightly after one of my sister's jokes. I noticed how he smiled less than he used to, how he always seemed to fade into the background at family gatherings, as if he were trying to make himself smaller. What made it harder was knowing there was nothing I could do to fix it. Not really. Every time I saw my sister belittle him, every time I watched him quietly accept it, I felt this rising frustration, not just with her but with myself. Why hadn't I spoken up sooner? Why hadn't I done more? There's a helplessness that comes with witnessing someone else's unhappiness, especially when it feels like they don't even realize how much they're hurting. Mike was so focused on keeping the family together, on being a good husband and father, that he seemed to believe his own needs didn't matter. That helplessness stayed with me, growing heavier each time I saw him brush off another insult or take on another responsibility that wasn't his alone to bear. By the time the dinner rolled around, the weight of it all had become too much. Speaking up wasn't just about defending Mike. It was about releasing the burden of silence that had been crushing me for years. As much as I was angry with my sister, I couldn't help but wonder if there was more to her behavior than what was visible on the surface. Over the years, I'd seen her lash out, retreat, and dismiss others, all while maintaining an exterior of confidence and control. But I began to question whether there was something deeper at play, something she wasn't willing to share. It wasn't an excuse, but I'd always felt there was a layer to my sister that she kept hidden. Growing up, she was the one who seemed to thrive under pressure, always wanting to be the best, to outshine everyone around her. It's easy to mistake that for confidence, but now, as adults, I wondered if it was something else entirely. Marriage and motherhood hadn't seemed to bring her peace. If anything, they amplified her defensiveness and need for control. When she teased Mike, was it really about him? Or was it about projecting her own insecurities onto someone she knew wouldn't fight back? Did she feel inadequate in some way, unable to meet expectations she set for herself or believed others had of her? There were moments when her frustration seemed to bubble over, and it wasn't always directed at Mike. Sometimes it was a passive-aggressive comment about how hard it was to raise a child, or a complaint about how exhausted she was, even though it was clear Mike carried most of the workload. At the time, I'd dismissed these comments as selfishness or laziness, but now I wondered if they were small glimpses into a deeper dissatisfaction she couldn't articulate. I didn't have answers, only questions. But even if my sister was struggling with her own issues, it didn't justify the way she treated Mike. Still, I couldn't shake the thought that her actions might stem from pain rather than malice. It made the situation feel even more complicated. Was there a way to reach her? To help her see the damage she was causing without making her feel attacked? Or was she too entrenched in her own defenses to listen? These questions lingered, pulling me in opposite directions. Family has always been complicated for us, and the dinner only reinforced just how much our shared history influences everything we do. The way everyone reacted, or didn't react, spoke volumes about the unspoken rules we've all followed for years. My mom's immediate anger at me for airing dirty laundry wasn't surprising. She's always been the glue trying to hold our family together, the one who smooths over conflicts and keeps things civil, even at the cost of addressing deeper issues. To her, my outburst wasn't just an attack on my sister. It was a disruption of the fragile balance she's spent years trying to maintain. My dad, as usual, stayed out of it. He's never been one to get involved in family disputes, preferring to keep his head down and let my mom take the lead. His silence felt heavier this time, though, as if he was avoiding more than just the argument. And then, there was my younger brother. His quiet agreement with me was unexpected, but appreciated. He's always been the observer, the one who notices everything but rarely speaks up. His validation meant a lot, even if he couldn't bring himself to say more in front of everyone. But the most striking dynamic was the one between my sister and Mike. She's always been the dominant force in their relationship, while he's the peacemaker. That balance, or imbalance, is so ingrained that I think everyone in the family has come to accept it as normal. It made me realize just how much our family's patterns have shaped how we interact. The unspoken rule seems to be, avoid conflict, even if it means ignoring what's right in front of you. By breaking that rule, I'd not only upset my sister, I'd disrupted the entire family dynamic. And now, I wasn't sure if it could ever go back to the way it was. The days following the dinner were consumed by a whirlwind of guilt and doubt. Every time I thought about what had happened, a new wave of conflicting emotions would crash over me. On one hand, I felt justified. Someone needed to say what I said. On the other, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made everything worse. The guilt came in layers. I felt guilty for embarrassing my sister in front of the family, for breaking an unspoken rule of keeping our issues private. I felt guilty for potentially making Mike's life harder, for stirring up more tension that he would inevitably have to deal with. And selfishly, I felt guilty for disrupting the family dynamic, knowing it might be a long time before things felt normal again. Then there was the doubt. Was I too harsh? Could I have approached it differently? Would my sister have listened if I'd chosen another time or another place to speak up? These questions gnawed at me, making it impossible to fully stand by my actions. What hurt the most was the silence from my sister. We hadn't spoken since the dinner, and every day that passed without a text or call from her felt like another confirmation that I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross. Part of me wanted to reach out, to apologize. Not for what I'd said, but for how I'd said it. But another part of me hesitated, worried that any attempt to fix things would just make her angrier. At the same time, I couldn't ignore the small voice in my head that kept saying, "You did the right thing." It reminded me of Mike's face during her jokes, the way his smile faltered just enough to reveal the hurt underneath. I wanted to believe that what I'd done had a purpose, that it wasn't just a moment of frustration boiling over. But in the absence of any resolution, the doubt continued to linger, making me question whether speaking up was truly worth the fallout it caused. In search of clarity, I turned to my friends. They'd always been my sounding board, offering perspectives that helped me make sense of things when my own emotions felt too tangled. I needed to know if I'd been completely out of line, or if my actions were at least somewhat justified. I told the story to a small group of my closest friends, careful to include every detail. Mike's kindness, my sister's behavior, the jokes at his expense, and of course, the explosion at dinner. As I finished, I braced myself for their reactions, fully expecting a mix of criticism and support. To my surprise, most of them sided with me, at least in principle. "Honestly, someone needed to say it," one of them said, shaking her head. "She sounds like she takes him for granted, and that's not okay." Another friend, though, was more cautious. "I get why you did it, but calling her out in front of everyone, that's tough," she said. "People don't usually respond well to being embarrassed, even if they're in the wrong. You might have shut her down instead of making her think." That point stung because it was one I'd been grappling with myself. Had I unintentionally pushed my sister further away from any chance of self-reflection? One friend, who knew my family dynamic well, offered a perspective that lingered with me. "I think you were right to stand up for Mike," she said. "But it sounds like this was about more than just him. Maybe you needed to say this for yourself too, to release everything you've been holding back about your sister for years." Her words hit close to home. I'd always thought of my outburst as a defense of Mike, but maybe it was also a way of addressing my own frustration with her. The conversation left me with more to think about, but it also gave me a small measure of comfort. I wasn't alone in believing that something needed to change. Of all the fallout from the dinner, the part that weighed on me most was how it might have affected Mike. My intention had always been to defend him, to let him know that someone in the family saw his sacrifices and respected him for everything he did. But as the days passed and the dust settled, I began to wonder if my actions had helped him or hurt him. Mike wasn't one to openly discuss his feelings, and he certainly hadn't said much during the dinner itself. His silence during the confrontation, though, felt louder than any words he could have spoken. I replayed his expression in my mind, his quick, nervous glance toward my sister, the way his jaw tightened slightly as the argument unfolded. He didn't look relieved or vindicated. He looked uncomfortable, maybe even embarrassed. I worried that by calling out my sister so publicly, I'd inadvertently made things worse for him. Would my sister's anger at me spill over into their home? Would she take out her frustration on him, either directly or through more subtle digs? Mike was already carrying so much. The last thing I wanted was to add to his burden. At the same time, I couldn't ignore the possibility that my words might have offered him a small measure of comfort. Maybe, just maybe, knowing someone had spoken up on his behalf gave him a sense of validation he rarely received, even if he didn't, or couldn't, say it aloud. I hoped he felt seen, at least for a moment. I thought about reaching out to him directly, but I hesitated. I didn't want to put him in an even more awkward position by bringing it up. Instead, I decided to wait, hoping that the next time I saw him, his demeanor might give me some clue about whether what I'd done had helped or hurt. The uncertainty lingered, a heavy reminder of how complicated this situation had become. Even my best intentions couldn't guarantee that I'd done the right thing for Mike, and that was a hard truth to sit with. As the days stretched into a week, the question of whether I should apologize to my sister loomed large. My mom hinted at it every time we spoke, her voice heavy with the expectation that I'd make the first move. "She's your sister," she'd say, as if that was reason enough to smooth things over. But I couldn't shake the feeling that any apology would feel hollow. I didn't regret standing up for Mike, and I certainly didn't believe what I'd said was wrong. Still, the way I'd delivered it, sharp, public, and undeniably humiliating, left me feeling conflicted. Could I apologize for how I said it without invalidating why I'd said it? Part of me felt stubborn, unwilling to back down when I believed I'd done the right thing. My sister had been out of line for years, and everyone, including me, had let it slide. By apologizing, would I be giving her permission to dismiss everything I'd said, to write it off as an emotional outburst instead of a genuine call for reflection? But another part of me recognized the damage my words had done, not just to her pride, but to our relationship. I didn't want this fight to become a permanent wedge between us. Regardless of how much I disagreed with her behavior, she was still my sister. And if there was any hope of mending things, an apology might be the first step. I toyed with the idea of reaching out, maybe starting with a message that acknowledged the impact of my actions without undermining their intent. Something like, "I'm sorry for the way I brought it up. It wasn't the best way to handle it, but I hope you understand why I said what I did." But the thought of her reaction stopped me every time. Would she even listen? Or would she use the apology as an opportunity to double down on her anger? For now, I decided to wait. Maybe time would soften the edges of her resentment. Or maybe I'd find the courage to reach out, knowing there was no guarantee it would fix anything. As the dust settled, I started to reflect on everything that had happened. Not just the fight, but the years of tension and unspoken frustrations that had led up to it. The dinner was a flashpoint, but the lessons I was starting to uncover ran much deeper. First, I learned that speaking up, even when it feels necessary, comes with consequences. My intentions had been good, but my delivery hadn't been perfect, and that had real repercussions. The fallout reminded me that timing, tone, and setting matter just as much as the message itself. Even the most valid points can get lost if they're delivered in a way that feels more like an attack than a conversation. Second, I realized how deeply ingrained family dynamics can shape our actions. My silence over the years wasn't just about avoiding conflict. It was about adhering to the unspoken rules of our family, the ones that prioritize harmony over honesty. Breaking those rules felt liberating, but it also left me feeling isolated, as though I'd stepped out of line in a way that might be hard to come back from. And then there was the most personal lesson, understanding my own emotions. My outburst at dinner wasn't just about defending Mike. It was about years of bottled-up frustration with my sister. I'd carried resentment toward her for so long, and the dinner gave me a moment to release it. Whether that was fair or not, I couldn't deny that it had been a driving force behind my words. Looking back, I wished I'd found a way to express myself sooner, before the resentment had grown so large. But even in its messiness, the experience taught me something important: that staying silent doesn't solve anything. The cost of speaking up might be high, but the cost of saying nothing can be even higher. Now that some time has passed, I'm left with a mixture of clarity and uncertainty. The dinner, as messy and painful as it was, forced me to confront truths about my family, my sister, and myself. It's left scars, no doubt, but it's also opened the door to a deeper understanding of our dynamics and the limits of my own patience. My sister and I still aren't speaking. I've thought about reaching out, but every time I pick up my phone, I hesitate. Part of me is afraid of what she might say, that she'll double down on her anger and dismiss everything I tried to convey. But another part of me wonders if she's thinking about it too, if some small part of her has started to see things differently. Mike has remained his usual quiet self, but at the last family gathering, he gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't much, but it felt like an acknowledgement. Maybe he appreciated what I'd said, even if he couldn't say it outright. As for the rest of the family, things are still tense. My mom continues to drop hints about fixing things, and my dad avoids the subject altogether. My brother, though, has been a steady source of quiet support, reminding me that not everyone in the family believes I was entirely in the wrong. What I've come to accept is that there might not be a neat resolution. Relationships, especially within families, are rarely black and white. I may never get an apology from my sister, or even an acknowledgement that my words hit home, but I've made peace with that. What matters to me now is that I said something when it felt impossible to stay silent. Even if it didn't change anything immediately, it was a step toward breaking the patterns that had kept us all stuck. And sometimes, that's enough.